everyone, welcome to the live cast. Good Monday afternoon. So I want to talk about a really interesting topic today about business continuity planning. Doesn't that sound really interesting? No, actually, I think it's actually quite fascinating because companies have been working for years to put in place practices and methods and systems to handle the unexpected possible disruption to their business. And I had a really interesting roundtable last week with a bunch of very senior business leaders across a wide range of industries. And it was a private event, and the topic was, so how did our business continuity planning hold up? And what have we learned during COVID about how we might want to change our business continuity planning going forward? So I'm going to talk about that today. I think I have some really interesting stuff to share with you. First, I want to make a really interesting announcement, really cool announcement. Of course, I'm perhaps constantly talking about my book, Winning Digital Customers. Apologize for the repeated discussion of it, but it is finally out in hardcover, or I should say I have in my hand the hardcover version. This is the actual final version. I got a big box of them from my publisher just last week. So we have these books now. They are going to be available. Of course, many of you already know the ebook has been available since October something or other. I think it was October 18th. The hardcover book is available to pre-order on Amazon right now. It ships on January 4th. But if you order the book directly on our website, and I'm going to give you a special URL for viewers of this live cast, which is wdc.ht/preorder. If you order the book from us, first of all, we're selling it for only $9.99. I think it's $27.99 on Amazon, something like that. Maybe it's $26.99. Anyway, something like that. And we also include 3 additional ebooks for free on related topics, which the information is available there at wdc.ht/preorder. And we have them now. I say now, we have the books. I think we're getting the boxes in. So they're going to be going out sometime in the next few days. So if you would like to order directly from us, you can do that. It will be less expensive. You will get extra free stuff. And we should be shipping them out at least a couple weeks in advance of the official launch date on Amazon. Of course, you are also most welcome to order it on Amazon if you love your Prime shipping and all that. And it is available for pre-order on Amazon right now. However, even if they have the books in hand, they will not send them out until they have their they hit the date that it's scheduled to launch, which is, I believe, January 4th, I think. So anyway, either way, I hope you get your hands on a copy of it. I'm really proud of it. And of course, so happy that we were able to get the ebook onto the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. So anyway, that's my quick commercial and excitement about what's going on with the book. So with that, let us talk about business continuity. So the question really at this roundtable that I was leading was, so how did our business continuity fare? Clearly, this was just the sort of thing that, in theory, we're preparing for with business continuity. The whole idea of business continuity planning is if something unexpected should happen, if we should have a disruption, if there should be a hurricane that hits our data center, how do we make sure that we don't lose too much money and we don't let our customers down by making sure that our business can continue, business continuity? And so classically, that often includes things like having backup redundant data centers, or if one of our facilities, manufacturing facilities, should have a power outage, or there should be civil unrest or something like that, then what would we do? Could we shift manufacturing to alternate facilities? So those are the types of things that most companies historically plan when working on business continuity plans. So we talked about really 3 or 4 key themes that were interesting insights about COVID and how the COVID crisis did and did not benefit from business continuity planning. So I just want to throw up a slide here. Yeah, hopefully you can see this if I keep it small. So the first theme that I heard from the folks that were participating in this roundtable was short versus long term. They said, our business continuity planning, by and large, anticipated relatively short-term crises, meaning a crisis that might last a week or a month, such as a hurricane causing a facility's power to be out, and it would take a period of time to restore it. They said, it wasn't that we totally didn't contemplate that there could be longer-term business continuity. And by the way, I should say there were a bunch of people that participated in this. They didn't all say the exact same thing. Some said, well, at our company, we encountered this, and in other companies, they said, well, our planning was a little different. So, for example, we had one participant who talked about, manufacturing facilities they were located in California, and they were mindful that there could be an earthquake that would destroy a manufacturing facility, which would obviously not be rebuilt in a very short period of time. So there were occasions where people were talking about longer term, but most of the business continuity planning had been focused on relatively short-term disruptions. And so naturally, COVID has been a relatively long-term disruption and continues. And so that was one area in which the group said that the kinds of planning that they had done wasn't necessarily as applicable as they might have hoped it would be. Again, a lesson learned to think about making sure your business continuity is not only focusing on short-term, but also long-term disruption. The second, and even more significant, was localized versus systemic. In other words, so much of business continuity planning is like the examples that I just gave you. Well, what if there's a hurricane in Houston, right? What if there's an earthquake in California? What if there's civil unrest in downtown Los Angeles and we can't get to our offices, as happened during the Rodney King riots? I had an office in downtown Los Angeles at that point in time. Funny story, I had a team, a design team I was leading at the time, and we were working in the Arco Towers, I think it's called, Arco Plaza, Arco Towers. I don't even know if it's still called that, probably not, on between Flower and Figueroa streets in downtown LA. And so I had watched TV the night before and knew that there were protests or something going on. And then I went to bed, and about 6 o'clock in the morning, my phone rings, and it's somebody on my team saying, "Hey, listen, everyone's calling each other. Are we supposed to go into the office today?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't we go into the office today?" We're like, well, the Rodney King stuff. And I'm like, "Please, what are you talking about? I'll see you at the office." So that word got back around to the rest of my team, and a dozen or so people that were on my team at the time. Everyone shows up to the office, and we were like the only people in the building, right? Like, this was a bad call by me, right? Anyway, but it was fascinating. We were up on I think we were on the 11th floor, if I remember, and we could see out in every direction. We were running to all the offices and looking out the windows, and we saw fires just burning in every direction. And of course, all of downtown LA was closed and largely unavailable. And then the building management kicked us out of the building a couple hours later. They said, "It's not safe here. The rioters are coming this way," and they made us leave. Of course, that only lasted really a few days. So again, it was short term, and it was also localized. While that occurred in several cities, it certainly wasn't happening absolutely everywhere. It was something, and even in Los Angeles, it wasn't happening everywhere. It was happening in certain areas. It just happened to be happening where I was, because downtown LA, for anyone who doesn't know, is only a few miles from South Central, which is where kind of the flashpoint of the Rodney King riots were. So bottom line, of course, COVID was systemic, right? It wasn't localized to a particular city, a particular area. Of course, initially it was, right? In the very early days, it was localized sort of where I happen to live, the New York, New Jersey area, and then we'd see it pop up in Florida and other places. But by now we have a systemic crisis. And so it's hard to say, oh, well, we'll just transfer the work that we were doing in this location to that location, because it's affecting pretty nearly everybody. The next is IT and facility related versus people related. What I heard from a lot, first of all, from some companies, they said, up until now, IT owned business continuity, right? It was an IT thing, because the mindset was that primarily we were talking about how does our technology continue? Right? What happens if there's an outage? What happens if our data center goes down? What happens if there's a power outage, where our systems are, those types of things. So some companies said IT had owned it, and they realized, of course, in COVID, IT was very important. But the main problem was not that our IT was down. In fact, we needed new IT, like enabling the support of people who were working from home. But the problem was not IT stopped working, like you might have in a power outage or a hurricane hitting your data center. The problem was, to some degree, facility related, but also heavily people related. So before I get to the people side, some other companies that participated in this roundtable said, well, no, we didn't have it owned by IT, because facility availability is also an important part of business continuity. And that tended to be companies that were more in the manufacturing business, where they said, well, no, it's not only IT. If our manufacturing facility, for example, can't get the supplies that it needs, because there's the roads are out due to a natural disaster, then that's just an IT issue. We can't actually manufacture our product at the factory. And then we have to figure out what to do. Do we manufacture it somewhere else? Or do we have another method of getting our raw materials to us, et cetera? So some companies saw business continuity as primarily an IT and facility related topic. But what few, if any, had previously thought of business continuity as is a people-related issue. What happens if a large percentage of your workforce is ill or can't come to work, or their children are working from home, so being schooled from home, so they're distracted and unable to fully participate in their job, or over time you have an extended, prolonged disaster situation like we're in now, and you have mental health issues amongst your team. So these types of business continuity issues had not been on the radar for really anybody that was participating in that roundtable, and there was widespread recognition that this is now needed, that we need to be thinking about the human side, because of course in most businesses people are the most important part of your business continuity, right? They're the most important part of delivering your business value proposition. And yet they were a part that really we hadn't been focused on for the most part in business continuity planning. And lastly is the issue of scenarios versus agility. What a lot of participants said was that a lot of their business continuity planning was scenario driven. In other words, what happens if there's a hurricane? What happens if there's an earthquake? What happens if there's a strike, some kind of a work stoppage, and preventing us from getting, for example, if there should be a trucking strike, for example, and that prevents us from getting the materials that we need. So these were more common scenarios. But what they said is there was nobody that participated in our roundtable where a pandemic was one of the scenarios that they had ever participated in any kind of contingency planning or business continuity planning around. And I think it just hasn't happened in so long that I think, and I'll count myself amongst the people that if you'd have said to me a year ago, we're going to have a major pandemic that's going to shut down the whole country, I would have said, not in this day and age, not with our healthcare systems the way they are. I don't think that's something from the past. And so naturally, a bit of overconfidence, right? But nevertheless, therefore, it was something that wasn't on the planning list. And so there's no question that going forward, pandemics will be part of the scenario planning process. Clearly, now we know that they can happen, that they are in fact much worse than many of the, in terms of their business impact and their impact in terms of human suffering, than compared to some of the natural disaster type situations that have tended to dominate our scenario planning. But the question got raised, well, we overlook pandemics, but is that really the problem? Or is the problem that we only plan for the types of scenarios that we think will happen? And so what if the next big disaster is not another pandemic or an earthquake or a hurricane? What then? Are we prepared for the unexpected? And so scenario planning, we had a very, very interesting discussion about this. And we actually have a couple members of the roundtable that also have former military backgrounds, which is fascinating because there's a lot of scenario planning, of course, done in the military where there's a lot of uncertainty of what could happen in a given battle, for example. And so the discussion was, is scenario planning even that worthwhile? Because if you fail to anticipate the right scenarios, one could argue that your scenario planning is not useful. In this case, if you have a detailed, here's exactly what we're going to do if a hurricane hits New Orleans and shuts down our facility there, we have a plan and it's documented. What's beautiful about that is when that happens, you're like, hey, we've thought this through. Grab the plan. We know exactly what to do. The problem is, well, what if that's not what happens? What if you have a drawer full of plans and none of those things happen and then some other thing happens? That's exactly what happened to every single company this time. They could have had 25 different scenarios that they planned, and none of them were a pandemic. And so you could argue that that drawer full of scenarios was not super useful. So I want to actually pull on this thread a little bit more because it led to some fascinating conversations. But the initial discussion was about scenario planning versus agility. Is it really mostly valuable to plan for specific scenarios? Or is it more important to think about how do we train our teams to deal with the unexpected? How do we get good at quickly mobilizing and being ready to respond to an unanticipated event? And there was a lot of agreement that more needs to be done for that because we may have another event that we fail to anticipate and we need to be better at dealing with. And by the way, a lot of companies did a really great job in responding, but nevertheless, I think that most people feel that they could have done an even better job if they'd have been more prepared. There was still a delay. There was still, challenges that maybe could have been handled even better had there been more preparedness. And of course, this varies by company, right? Some companies, for example, had very agile and flexible IT stacks, and it allowed them to change their customer value proposition, add order online, pick up at curbside, add attestations to their employee HR systems, very quickly change their inventory allocations to deal with closed stores and deal with suppliers flexibly and do a lot of things. And a lot of that kind of baseline agility that they may have built into their systems and business processes, maybe not in anticipation of a pandemic, probably not, but in anticipation more likely of a rapidly changing business environment, because that's a lot of what a lot of companies are dealing with now, is that in the world of digital transformation, so much changes so fast in business anyway, that they need to be able to respond quickly to new customer expectations, new competitive pressures. And so what most of the participants in this roundtable indicated was it was actually that was the most useful to them. It was not anticipation of a pandemic, but it was just the need for agility, which then turned out to be useful in this pandemic. You could argue a little bit lucky, right? Because again, it wasn't the reason they created that agility, but nevertheless, that agility was extremely beneficial to them. So we had a whole discussion about whether have we proven that scenario planning is not as valuable as we thought it was, because in this case, we hadn't planned the right scenario. And I think here we landed on it. I think everyone agreed at the end, though, on a couple of things. And let me caveat that. I'm not sure everyone 100% agreed, but I'm trying to give you the character of some of the conversation because it was a very interesting conversation. One point is, clearly there are some scenarios that are reasonably likely to happen, right? A power outage, a labor stoppage. And surely it makes sense to put together a scenario plan for those situations because they could have a reasonable likelihood of happening. And then there are other scenarios that are far, far less likely to happen, but are not impossible, such as a pandemic. And for those, general agility is the most beneficial. But, and here was a fascinating thing that one of our members talked about from his experience in the military, the process of going through a whole bunch of different scenarios and having teams work on anticipating what to do in different scenarios is actually fantastic training for the unknown. And there's two reasons. So in other words, let me be clear. Even if the scenario you wind up facing is totally unlike the scenario you planned for, and therefore the actual plan you put together is worthless because the situation is different, you still get two major benefits from having done the scenario planning. The first is a training of the mind, because the people who come together, and typically you're talking about multidisciplinary teams, right? Operations people, logistics people, IT people, marketing and communications people, HR people, it's all part of the mix. They will have gone through enough scenarios that they've practiced through those scenarios how to think about a disruptive incident and think about how to come up with a contingency plan. And so even if you hadn't had the foresight to pre-plan the scenario that you encounter, because you've done it for 25 other scenarios as a team, you've practiced. So now you know how to approach the thinking, even when you're faced with a different set of facts and situations than what you actually, were faced with, what you are faced with in the real situation. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the first benefit. And the second benefit is what we called fragments, meaning, let's say you planned for a massive flood, which disrupted your supply chain so trucks could no longer bring raw materials to your factories. And all of a sudden you encounter a pandemic, which there's no flooding, trucks can drive, but you can't get your supplies for the reason, right? The truck drivers won't drive because they can't go to the factories because the factories are closed. You still have the same underlying problem. Your raw materials are not coming to you. So in other scenarios, you'll find some parallels and similarities, and you will still have gone through the creative process of thinking about, well, how would we deal with it if we had a disruption to our raw materials? How would we deal with it if our labor force was disrupted? Maybe you anticipated a strike and not a pandemic, but nevertheless, you've thought through this sort of general topic. So that's what we mean by fragments, meaning the new disaster you encounter may not be the same, and therefore your exact plan may not be applicable. But again, you will have exercised your thinking and you will have done the sort of work to come up with different creative approaches to the sort of more generalized problem. So the conclusion was, we should continue to do scenarios. We should also think about being as agile as possible. And we should recognize that as we do these scenario plans, they are actually a good training and preparation for even scenarios which we fail to anticipate. And I guess I'll just close on that point by saying one of the things we decided to do at the end was do a lightning round and say, okay, if we were going to pick some scenarios that maybe we're not so focused on right now, not earthquakes, hurricanes, and labor stoppages, but other types of scenarios that belong in our possible scenario planning exercise set, what would those be? Either things that are less likely to occur, but not impossible. And furthermore, the planning for which may be good training for the minds of the team members and for the collaborative tasks that team members need to engage in when dealing with these types of situations. So I just thought for fun, I thought I'd share with you the list of the top 12 things that came out of this roundtable. What are some different scenarios that we should be thinking about? Things that could happen, hopefully won't happen. This is kind of a depressing list in a way because it's a list of a lot of really bad things that could happen, but it's a good exercise. Hopefully none of them will happen, and the process of thinking them through will be a beneficial exercise. So drought, certainly with climate change, and there's probably other climate change related factors that could impact us, but clearly significant drought, which again has occurred in this century, in this country, right? But not recently, not in a sizable way, but some sort of massive drought. So that was the first one. Flooding, another thing that could possibly result from climate change. Again, something we've seen localized, but could be worse, or it could be localized. You know, it's fine to plan for localized scenarios, and maybe that's a scenario some people are already planning for. Government bankruptcy. It's been pointed out that several municipalities, like mostly cities, have hit points of bankruptcy in the last decade, and especially, well, any economic crisis has the risk of creating insolvency for a county, state, or even the federal government or a city. And so depending on what level it is and what the impact on your business could vary, but the thinking through the possibility that some functions of our government could become bankrupt or stopped for some other reason, and we'd have to deal with how to continue business in that situation. War, of course, and we have had a certain amount of war over the last few decades, but generally those wars have been in other locations. There has been some impact, but not a lot of impact, frankly, more business opportunity created by those wars than negative impact to business continuity. Obviously, if there should ever be war locally here in our country, clearly that would potentially be substantially disruptive in terms of business continuity. So thinking about the impact of war. And there are, of course, different types of wars and different types of attacks, things that we might want to be prepared for. Insect infestation, right? Yikes. But there's numerous scientific studies that indicate that there could be reason to think that something like that has the possibility of occurring. And if it should occur, you know, what would the impact be? What types of raw materials would be needed? What kinds of responses would be needed? What kinds of things that we take for granted today would be problematic? And, well, frankly, what would we need to do to continue our business in the situation of a massive insect infestation? Power blackout, again, another type of contingency that a lot of people are already planning for, but what if it was a more prolonged and systemic power blackout? Instead of a 6-hour or 1 or 2 day power blackout in part of Los Angeles, what if it was a nationwide blackout that lasted 2 weeks? How would we deal with a situation like that? That sort of thing has never occurred. Could it ever occur? Well, we know that our power system is potentially susceptible to hacking by foreign enemies. And so while, of course, we hope this never happens, it's not outside the realm of possibility that something could happen to our power infrastructure. And similarly, the internet. Of course, there's always occasional problems with the internet. It's become more and more and more reliable, which is great, but also possibly dangerous because we've become so reliant on it. What would happen in this country if something happened to the internet such that we had no internet connectivity for an extended period of time? What would happen to your business if you had no internet connectivity for a day? What if you had no internet connectivity for a month? What would you do? Are you prepared for something like that? And is that the kind of scenario that you might want to think about preparing for, either so that you have a scenario in the event that should happen, and also as an exercise to train the minds of your team members so that if a totally different scenario occurs, you may have come up with some ideas from that scenario that are applicable, fragments, or just train your mind on how to think through and deal with some kind of extreme, seemingly unimaginable scenario. Another extreme one would be breakdown of democracy, although obviously it seems less extreme than it used to. If there should be some sort of move in our government towards authoritarianism, Who knows? Maybe that wouldn't even be bad for your business. Of course, I'm against it, but I'm just saying a question would be, if that should happen, what might be the impact on business? Is there any kind of preparation that we would need to be engaged in, or any kind of planning we'd want to do? Radiation goes together with war to some degree, but of course, radiation can come from multiple sources, nuclear power plants being the most obvious one, as well as some kind of attack, dirty bomb, et cetera. Even if we're not at war, it could be terrorism. So what other kinds of preparation should we be doing if there should be a part of the country, or even the whole country, impacted by radiation in such a way that we couldn't go out of doors, or we needed to take other safety precautions? Again, I apologize for the fact that this list is a little bit of a downer, but that doesn't mean you can't have fun thinking about these as, fictional scenarios, and challenging yourself with the puzzle of asking, what would we do? And let's be honest, if we'd have said a year ago, there's going to be a massive pandemic that's going to cause us to shut down all our businesses, there's a tendency to not want to think about this kind of stuff, right? To say, oh, please, why are you talking about such a downer? Can you imagine if you'd have been in a meeting, a 2020 planning meeting in November of 2019, and someone said, what do you think we need to be thinking about in 2020? And you raised your hand and said, well, have we thought about how to prepare in case there's a global pandemic that kills millions of people and causes all of our businesses to shut down? I think most people would be like, who invited this guy to this meeting? Why are you wasting our time with this nonsense? So if any of these items on this list feel like that, I would just ask you to put your mind back into that moment. I'm not saying these things are going to happen, but gosh, now that we've had the pandemic, this is why we had our roundtable, right? These are some of the things that we're learning from just thinking the process through. So just a couple more. Lack of trust or compliance with government regulators. Again, one of the things that we've seen happen in our society over the last few years is a diminishment of trust in whether it's our courts, our Justice Department, our elections, et cetera. And so business relies on a number of governmental bodies that regulate things and also give the public trust and confidence. Of course, with these vaccines that are coming out, we see what the challenge is if the public feels that they can't trust the Food and Drug Administration. And by the way, that's not just drugs. The F stands for food. What if people felt they could no longer trust meat inspections or poultry inspections, or ensuring that our food supply was reliable and safe? What about banking? What if people came to distrust banking regulators and were concerned that they couldn't trust banks to be solvent and that the FDIC wouldn't be there for them? Or, FAA, what if people became less confident that they could be trusting that that our transportation infrastructure was being properly monitored and properly measured and properly kept safe? So what would happen if some of these things break down, if the trust of the public breaks down in some of these things? 11, breathability of air. If climate change or some other factor should mean that, and we started to see some of this in certain parts of the Far East, right, where there were days when the breathability of the air in, for example, parts of China and other countries was dangerous, and some people would stay in, or people would walk around with masks, and this was before COVID, right? If that should get to the point where that becomes an issue, well, again, what businesses would benefit? What new needs would there be? What challenges would your business have in order to continue operating if the air outside was not at its normal level of breathability? Good news is that COVID and all the reduction in, lots of things, manufacturing and trucking and other things, has in many areas helped to improve the breathability of the air by producing less emissions. But of course, very likely we're going to go back to where we were before, giving the earth a brief respite, but it probably won't continue once COVID's over. And so that's certainly a business continuity risk. And the last one here, alien invasion or zombie apocalypse. Okay, that was there just for fun. But, is it totally impossible there could be an alien invasion? I don't know. There's certainly enough movies about it. Anyway, probably more likely than the zombie apocalypse. But if you were looking for scenarios to do just for fun or just for exercise, for practice, an extreme scenario like an alien invasion, no joke, might not be a bad thing. One of the things in iBusiness we do is we do workshops. We bring teams of together, lately more on Zoom, but historically in our facility in Manhattan, the Innovation Loft, we bring teams together to engage in group collaborative exercises to help them do things like strategic planning, visioning, decision-making, and certainly things like continuity planning. So business continuity. So, sometimes it can be more fun to think about something crazy like that than it is to think about something that could really happen. I'm not saying you shouldn't think about things that should really happen, could really happen. And again, I'm not here to tell you that there definitely won't be an alien invasion. Who knows? Okay, so those are the 12 scenarios that came out of our discussions at our roundtable. Obviously, there are others, but I thought that would be fun to give you. We'll try to make an infographic or something of this and get that out there in case anyone wants to use it. And hopefully this has been interesting. It's certainly interesting for me to look at a process that was meant to prepare us for the unexpected, which has been helpful, but not as helpful as maybe it was supposed to be. An opportunity to think about how to improve that for the future. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for watching. I want to remind you once again that the book is now available and you can pull that up. If someone can please pull up that. There we go. You go to wdc.ht/pre-order, and it won't be pre-order for very much longer because they're shipping out just in a couple of days. So it'll just, I don't know. I guess we have to change the URL, right, to order, but don't type order. I think it's just pre-order right now. Anyway, so I hope you get the book if you don't already have it. Maybe you already have it, and hope this has been helpful. And by all means, put any questions in the comments on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching this, and we'll keep an eye on those. If you have any questions or comments, we'd be very interested in your thoughts about how business continuity do in your company, and are there any other scenarios, any other depressing possible things that could happen that you want to add to our list. So again, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.